Hono is fire. And literally, like that's the name. That's where it comes from. It's the Japanese word for flare or for flame. But Hono is a web framework and it's taking off. It's super, super popular right now. I haven't built anything crazy in production with it, but I was really impressed with it when I first started using it for our Lambda benchmark project. But I want to talk about it because they just published a blog post. The author, Yusuke, just published a blog post about the story of creating this web framework, how it came to be, and it also has a bunch of really interesting engineering in it that we should get into. So let's take a look. So I have been benchmarking frameworks and Lambda functions for a while. This was back in May. But one thing that continually stood out to me was that Hono was routinely the fastest cold starting option, even though it was arguably like more flexible and more powerful than some of the other projects, including things like serverless HTTP or serverless express or Vercels functions. This is really impressive. Obviously, everybody here is putting a lot of work into making their project as low latency as possible. But I think Hono, it being so tiny at 12 kilobytes, is just like impossible to beat without other people really giving up like their specific niche. So it's really impressive. You can see the blue line in this photo, which is a little small, is actually the base AWS Lambda function. So it's not running any code. And that orange line is Hono. So it's very, very, very close. It's almost impossible to beat Hono in a shootout. Really, really impressed here. And other folks like Dax also talking about Hono is pretty impressive. We're talking here about mono functions. I talked about mono functions a long time ago. I'm a big fan of mono functions. I think it should be a great default choice. Create one API in one Lambda function. If you really need to split this out, you totally can. I have a whole blog post about this. Perhaps one of the single most impressive design bits about Hono as a framework is that it is a JavaScript project that has zero dependencies. Zero, none. They only have dev dependencies for types, builds, prettier, that kind of thing. There's actually no runtime dependencies in Hono. That's one of the reasons it's so teeny. That's one of the reasons it's so fast. Yusuke was able to build the trie URL parser and everything else in plain vanilla JavaScript and give it to you with as little overhead as possible. I think that's really, really impressive. All right, the story of the web framework Hono from the creator of Hono. Hono is a fast, lightweight web framework that runs anywhere JavaScript does, built with web standards. And of course it runs on Cloudflare. It's the person, Yusuke, works at Cloudflare, but runs anywhere. This is crazy. This is like the holy grail. I used to work at Serverless Inc. They make the serverless framework. And at the time, especially early on, one of the holy grail of serverless framework projects was like, we wanted to be able to run your application on GCP, on Azure, on AWS, or anywhere. It actually has, I think, still in the core, a plugin for IBM's OpenWhisk. But those never really took off. And to be honest, like the actual core of the project really only works on Lambda. It's already really impressive right out of the gate that Hono can actually get deployed on Cloudflare. It can get deployed on Vercel. It can go and run on Lambda. It runs Lambda at Edge. It does a ton of different stuff right out of the box, which is crazy. And it's like the passion project of like one guy. So it was 3 years ago, December 2021. At that time, I wanted to create applications for workers, but the code became verbose without using any framework. And I couldn't find a framework that suited my needs. Classic case right here, right? Like nothing really works for me. There's some things circling around this, but nothing works perfectly. So ID router was nice, but too simple. Worktop and Sunder did the same thing I wanted to do, but their APIs weren't quite to my liking. This is classic, and it's a good sign. It's a good sign because I think sometimes early on in their career, like open source developers will rewrite things just to be like a little bit different. But I do like it because I think it's good for, especially an open source developer, to have a strong opinion about a design of an API. And when they don't quite like it, it's like, well, I'm going to make my own. So I think it was also interesting creating a router, a program that determines which action is executed based on HTTP method and the URL route of the request. I made a tree structure because it's fast. So I started building a web framework with a tree based router. Another classic hallmark of a kind of, independent hacker, right? So I'm working on this thing. I don't quite like the API. I want to build it myself. And at the same time, I want to learn about this data structure, a tree. And I want to, build this thing on my own. And then this beautiful project Hono came out of it. If you haven't used a tree, the easiest way to describe it is it's just like really, really good at prefix matching. So we don't have to go into it. You get, linear lookups, O(n) lookups, but effectively the first letter and then the second letter of each combination of words are pushed out on nodes of the tree. So it's like the root node is empty, the first letter T or A or I. So it's like IN in, right? T, TED, 10, you can kind of see how you traverse this graph to get down here. And you can see exactly how that applies to a URL, right? Because you match like HTTP or HTTPS, // and then you have your domain. And then from there, you kind of keep parsing through the route. And as you parse a route, you'll get a smaller and smaller list of actions you can take until you get to like, the get or the put or like a resource or that sort of thing. So you can see how that could match really, really nicely with like the native kind of expression of the problem of parsing a URL, which is a hard thing to get right. So very cool. Yusuke wanted to build a fast router, and that's where this started. When trying to create my applications, I ended up creating my framework for them. A classic example of yak shaving. It is. And I like that there's like enough self-awareness here from Yusuke to talk about that. But it's also where a lot of really good ideas come from. However, Hono is used by so many developers, including Cloudflare, which uses Hono in core projects. I know that they're using it now for Baseline, the observability company, friends of mine that were acquired by Cloudflare. And I wonder if they'll talk about it. So this journey into the depths of yak shaving was ultimately meaningful. It was meaningful even without the framework. The learning process was probably pretty awesome. Write once, run anywhere. Let's get to the most impressive part of the project. Hono truly runs anywhere, not just on workers. I'll discuss why later in the post, but Hono also runs on Dino, on Bun, and Node. This is because Hono does not depend on external libraries, but uses only the Web Standards API, and each runtime supports Web Standards. It's a delight for developers to know that the code can run across different runtimes. For instance, the following index will run on workers, Dino, and Bun. Now, obviously, this is quite simple. And what they did was they sort of routed everything in this context object. And that specifically, I'm assuming, does vary a little bit by runtime. But in this case, you can kind of get a context and then write the request out or write the response out in text. For Hello World, you export the app and it'll run it. Wrangler will run it in Cloudflare. Dino will serve it. Bun will serve it. It's only a Hello World example, but more complex applications with middleware and helpers are discussed below can be run on workers and other runtimes. As proof of this, almost all of our test code for Hono can run in the same way on these runtimes. This is a genuine write once, run anywhere experience. It's not impossible to do this, and it was never impossible for anybody in another project to make this work. It takes a lot of discipline, and I'm really impressed every time I read the Hono source code. You can see it. For example, in the repo, what we're looking at now, they've got the project sort of divided into various separations of concerns, and then what they do is they've got this adapter directory where they kind of are able to make that request or response work for any runtime, be it Pages, Workers, Dino, Lambda at Edge, Netlify, even Vercel and Lambda. There's a non-negligible amount of work here, but you can see what they're doing, right? They've got a handler. This is what adheres to like the API gateway, V2 or V1 API. So they have to like convert it back to that format and convert it from that format back to a request. They have this kind of ports and adapter setup for Lambda and for every other project. So it's really, really easy for them to take their core of their project and build it elsewhere. It's easy to read this and think, oh, I could totally do this, no problem. It's actually a lot more difficult in practice because it's very easy to take a shortcut in a domain model and say, okay, I'm just going to do this one conditional somewhere instead of actually like make this adapter thing. But they're even doing some of the hard parts like streamify response. So they have to expect an error here because it's not in the standard API. I actually wrote a library that does this because I was so frustrated about this. I mean, they're completely right. This doesn't exist. This streamify response for Lambda doesn't exist anywhere. So you have to load it from the global scope. So I wrote this library that actually helps fix that by creating a local version of this module that then just goes away when you deploy it to Lambda. But I digress. The most important part is they understand all these nuances of all these different runtimes, and it's built into this project, and that way you don't have to think about it. And I think that is really, really impressive, and I'm stoked about that. So who is using Hono? Hono is used by many developers and companies. For example, Unkey deploys their application with Hono's open API feature to Cloudflare workers. Some other people who's saying who is using Hono in production, Cloudflare, Nodecraft, OpenStatus. I haven't really heard of the rest of these. There are also many more companies not listed, and major web services such as Prisma, Resend, Vercel, Upstash use Hono in their examples. That's a good thing, right? Like Hono is considered mature enough that they're putting that in their docs. I think that's great. Of course, at Cloudflare, we also use Hono. D1 uses Hono. I didn't know that for internal web API running on workers. Workers logs is based on code from Baseline. Oh, and it uses Hono to migrate the applications from their original infrastructure to workers. So it was an AWS application, and they've migrated already. That's pretty impressive. I didn't know that was done. All workers logs, internal or customer-facing APIs are run on workers using Hono. That's cool. And we also use Hono as part of the internals of our many other projects, such as KV and Qs. Very sweet. I didn't know that they had migrated already. That's interesting. That's not an easy lift. Kudos to the baseline team. Why are you making a multi-runtime framework? I mean, beyond the obvious need in this space for one. Why is an employee of Cloudflare creating a framework that runs everywhere? Initially, Hono was designed to work exclusively for workers. In V2, they added support for Dino and Bun. That was a wise decision. If Hono had been targeted only Cloudflare workers, it might not have attracted as many users. By running on more runtimes, it gains more users, leading to the discovery of bugs, receiving more feedback, which ultimately leads to higher quality software. I would also say, I mean, it's like the only one that does this really everywhere well. And that in and of itself is probably a huge part of the attraction to it. I think everybody else wants one simple API they can learn once and then kind of run everywhere. That is not too much to ask as a developer. I think that's fair, and more projects should do this, but kudos to Yusuke and the Cloudflare team for putting that into Hono. The combination of Hono and Cloudflare offers a delightful developer experience. Many websites, including our Cloudflare docs, introduce the following vanilla JavaScript as a hello world for workers. Export default, you've got fetch, return new response. This is primitive and good understanding for workers principle. However, if you want to create an endpoint that, quote, returns a JSON response for GET requests that come into /books, you need to write something like this. Okay, so now you need the request router. And this is what they're getting at. This is the value that Hono is going to bring. But if you use Hono, you can just match that route /books. And that's where that tree is, right? That's what that tree is doing. It is going down the URL, doing a match, and then ripping it into this function. So if you want to handle GET requests like authors Yusuke and get Yusuke from the path, Yusuke is a variable. And now you can add something more complicated. Parsing it out, I think a lot of us have done this at some point. This sucks, and it gets really bad really quickly. And I think that's when everyone starts reaching for a router like Express or something. If you use Hono, you don't need if statements. Just add the endpoint definition to your app. You also just don't need to write the regular expression to get Yusuke. Just grab it. That is so nice. So you parameterize the name. This is a parameterized route. API Gateway does this for you, actually. You can name a parameterized route in API Gateway. That's really convenient, but I totally understand like the rest of them don't. So they have to build it in here. But that's not even the most impressive part. I think they're going to talk about it. It's crazy small, too. Like, Hono is so small. Maybe, okay, we'll get to there. One or two routes may be fine, but any more of that and maintenance becomes tricky. Code becomes more complex, bugs are harder to find. Using Hono, the code is very neat. I would agree. That is super pragmatic, and then you can just grab that parameter. I think that's awesome. It's also easy to bring bindings to Cloudflare products, such as KV, R2, D1, as Hono uses a, quote, context model. A context is a container that holds the application state until a request is retrieved and a response is returned. You can use the context to retrieve a request object, set response headers, create custom variables. It also holds Cloudflare bindings. For example, if you want to use a KV namespace for Cloudflare, you can access it as follows. The context object is everywhere now. That felt like it was like a new pattern at some point, but now it's like all over the place. Lambda has it in their context variable. I mean, Go is very famous for having the context with like the request timeout, and it holds it's like a thread local variable for that request, which is super convenient because you can jam all sorts of stuff in it. You can run timeouts in it. You can pass trace headers around in there. It's super convenient for that. Hono lets you write code in a simple and intuitive way, but that doesn't mean there are limitations. You can do everything possible with Cloudflare workers using Hono. That's pretty cool, and that is really impressive because typically you trade off like abstractions for power and value, right? Like I think the most common critique I hear over and over again is if you're going to use AWS to its fullest potential, you're going to use things that aren't necessarily portable, right? Like you're going to use Lambda, which you can't necessarily run everywhere. And what projects like Hono bring are the ability to actually run this anywhere again, which is a super useful concept. This is also the super impressive part. There's no dependencies. There's no other dependency on this. It's a 12 kilobyte project, which is nuts. I mean, I know how big all of your cold starts are. I see them. And people DM me all the time and ask me why it's so slow. Y'all are shipping megabytes of JavaScript frameworks to your Lambda functions. And at the same time, Hono is ready. 12 kilobytes. You can just use this instead. It's awesome. Stop shipping megabytes. Just use Hono. Bundled Express is still 579 kilobytes, which is like much larger. Obviously, but still it's half a meg. That's not that bad compared to what I've seen some of you people put in Lambda functions. However, there's much that you can do. You can add functions using middleware. For example, it is a bit tedious to implement basic authentication from scratch, but they've got a basic auth middleware, and you can apply it just with a basic auth wrapper for a method. Import basic auth from Hono. That's pretty sweet. And now you've got an auth page. You got a username and password for basic auth. Pretty slick. Hono's package also includes built-in middleware that allows bearer and JWT authentication and easily configuration of cores. These built-in middleware components do not depend on external libraries, but there is also many third-party middleware that allows you the use of external libraries, such as Clerk, Auth.js, and validators like Zod and Validbot. Very cool. Now you get that like total validation of all of your parameters, which is important. The streaming helper. So we were talking about streaming already, right? Like the streaming in AWS Lambda. That was one of the things that actually Vercel beat Lambda 2. Vercel had it first, Lambda added it second. And then it sort of proliferated, and it was especially prescient given that it was initially done for server-side rendering. I'm sorry, but it's now much better and more useful for AI. In Cloudflare Workers, there is a limit to the file size of a worker. Keeping the core small and extending functions with middleware and helpers makes a lot of sense for sure. The onion structure. Here we go. Not a layer cake, huh? What's the old Shrek joke? The important concepts of Hono are handler and middleware. Handler is a place to write a function that receives a request and returns a response as specified by the user. For example, you can write a handler that gets a value of a query parameter, retrieves data from the database, and returns the result in JSON. 95% of you probably do that full time for work. Middleware can handle the requests that come into the handler and the responses that the handler returns. You can combine middleware with other middleware to build more large and complex applications. It's structured like an onion. So you have this request, your middleware wraps A, B, and C, the handler returns the response, and then eventually that is written out to the client. In a remarkably simple way, you can create middleware. For example, a custom logger that logs the request can be written as follows. So you've got, if you've written Express, you've seen this, right? You've got the context or the request object, then you've got the next method. So you just do whatever you need to do to the request, and then you await next. This is also super common for auth, right? Where you'll have to like, you have an async method that you can call that's going to go out and make a request to like resolve a token or a JWT or something. And then you await next, which is like the next item of middleware. That could be your actual handler. It could be a couple of different things. You can also write middleware to handle things like 404s. You want to just wrap everything with like a 404 handler where if nothing else hits, that one hits. Pretty common. RPC is like magic. Hono has a strong type system. One feature that uses this is RPC. With remote procedure calls, you can express server-side API specification as TypeScript types. When these types are loaded as generics in a client, the paths, arguments, and return types of each API endpoint are inferred. It's like magic. TRPC does this. I think there's a couple of different projects that do that now, where you can effectively export a type from your backend and then you immediately import it to your front end, so you get a perfect one-to-one locking. I would say that even in the case where you have like a monolithic application, there's never a way you can perfectly deploy that without a breaking change, right? Because it's very, very difficult to fully synchronize, especially like a multi-AZ or a multi-node setup, to fully synchronize a deployment at once. It's almost impossible. So while this is great, you really have to be thinking about being incremental and having not breaking. You have to really think about incremental changes and not introducing breaking changes to your schema, because if you do that in a production environment, you'll have an outage where for a brief period of time during the deployment, the front end doesn't speak the right language of the back end or vice versa. You can create a handler that receives this object in JSON format via post request to paths/posts. Using Zod Validator, you can check the schema so you can get it back and forth. You know that it's going to be valid. That's pretty sweet. All right, there are a few more things here. Testing, JSX. And they did announce some new things in V4, which is static side generation, client components, and file-based routing. These are pretty neat. I'm a fan of these changes, although I would say I'm not really making a ton of full stack applications these days. But I am really excited that they're doing it, because they're obviously eating in on some of the other large frameworks in the space, including like Next.js, where they're going to have like a more portable option. And they also had a conference. Very cool. I explained this at the beginning of the talk, but the name is Hono, from the Japanese word that means flare, or similar to the word that means flare. So Hono now runs on different runtimes, but originally it was for Cloudflare applications, and it's an honor that Cloudflare has remained in the name. Just try it. Definitely just try it. Go to the website, go to hono.dev, try it out. I'm really impressed with this. In closing, great job, Yusuke and the Cloudflare team. Hono is a really impressive piece of technology. I'm glad I've been able to try it out. I'm impressed with its performance. I'm impressed with what it can do on workers and outside of workers. And I think we need more projects like this that are dedicated to being able to write the code once and run it anywhere. If you like Hono, let me know in the comments. Please like this video and subscribe, and keep in tune for more videos. Take care. Peace.